Hello, I'm Mariana Mancuso, and welcome to our first Ram Chat of the new year. A year ago, Representative Abigail Spanberger was in the Capitol as insurrectionists stormed the building to overturn our elections, creating one of the ugliest scenes in American history. Today, Representative Spanberger joins co-founder of Renew America Movement, Miles Taylor, for a Ram Chat about her experiences on January 6, 2021, and the importance of holding those responsible accountable. Without further ado, Miles, the show is yours.
Great. Thank you, Mariana. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited to speak with Congresswoman Spanberger today. She's got an extraordinary reputation. She is a person who works across the aisle. And for me, as someone who's had a lot of time in the national security community, really excited to talk to her. For folks who don't know Congresswoman Spanberger, she's a former CIA officer. She is an absolute national security professional and leader, and now, of course, a member of Congress, again, representing Virginia's 7th District. Congresswoman, great to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Miles. I appreciate it.
And I hate to start us off on such a somber note, but we're speaking on this anniversary and looking back at what happened on January 6th. I want to ask you, in the time that you spent in the intelligence community, you were really focused on external threats. Did it ever cross your mind that we would see an internal one like this, like we saw on January 6th? And did this have any echoes of things that you saw in your career as you were focused outwardly around the world?
Well, certainly there's been, domestic terror organizations. There's been challenges domestically. Within my purview, when I was a CIA officer, we were focused on external threats. Though, anti-government organizations existed, we were aware of them. Certainly there were many experts in that field, particularly within the law enforcement community. But what we saw on January 6th was so different, and I think unthinkable in many ways, and because of what it represented, right? So we had thousands of our fellow American citizens marching angrily towards the Capitol, and then breaking glass and breaking down doors and windows and beating police officers, engaging in hand-to-hand combat in order to invade the United States Capitol building. And they're equipped with, they've got flexi cuffs and they've got gallows they've erected, and they're wearing bulletproof vests and other gear as though they're on a tactical mission, right? Like all of those elements, there's pieces of everything from the dressed in black looking like a ISIS or Al Qaeda member to, the flexi cuffs, like going out and trying to be commandos of some sort in some insurgent effort. My time at CIA, we had prepared for all of these potential occurrences. What happens if you are overseas, and what happens if you're in a government facility meeting with people overseas, or you're in a US embassy and it gets overtaken? Like, how do you react to that, right? And we have these scenarios where the notion of, in some other country, in some far off place, this type of violence could or may occur. But the fact that it was happening at the United States Capitol is really, it's extraordinary in what it means to kind of, even a year later, think about that and wrap your brain around it.
When we were in the lead up to that day, a lot of us after the election were worried that there was going to be violence. In fact, I remember in October before the election talking to a friend, a very senior official at the FBI, who said, we think, we can't say this publicly, we think the president's rhetoric is directly contributing to potential public safety threats. He's fanning the flames. And so they have these task forces across the country really looking at different domestic terrorist groups, people who want to commit violence. Again, to be clear, not people who had political opinions one way or the other, but who wanted to commit violence because of those political opinions. And they were gearing up for it. So there was a sense that something could happen. What was the feeling on Capitol Hill? Was there worry among members of Congress that this could spill over into violence?
Broadly speaking, no, there wasn't. I think broadly speaking across the Capitol, there was there were concerns because certainly out in our communities, we were hearing rumblings of people who were unhappy or people who had concerns or, people who were falling in line with this sort of rhetoric. And so there were certainly angry town halls and the like. But again, because of the COVID protocols and precautions, there was a little bit of kind of a step apart from how immediate that threat of the physicality of that rhetoric, how it could become so violent. For me, I was really, really worried. And I felt a little bit alarmist at times because I was telling colleagues, we should be concerned, dress down, don't dress like a member of Congress. I told my whole team, anybody who doesn't need to be here, don't be here. If you come to work, wear sweatpants, wear yoga pants, look like you're going to the gym. Because my concern was that, around the Capitol, that people who looked like they might, work on the Hill could just get heckled or could be inadvertently sort of find themselves in a position that they don't want to be in. Even for me, I didn't really imagine the possibility that there could be an actual violent attack on the Capitol building.
And what was the moment you feel like was sort of the inflection point on the day of? Was it members of Congress being taken to a secure location? When did it hit your colleagues that this was real, right? This is not a test?
I think it's actually a really interesting question because I've thought a lot about this over the past year. I think that inflection point for some members of Congress occurred over a period of days. From January 6th and beyond, because notably on that day, we were going to be voting to certify the election. But in the morning time, and when the assault on the Capitol started on the kind of early afternoon into the mid-afternoon, most members of Congress were actually not in the Capitol. Some were in their offices, but we didn't have votes expected until later in that evening. So or later in that afternoon, because of COVID protocols, because of the way we were doing a lot of telework, many people were back at their DC apartments or where they stay when they're in town, as opposed to on the Capitol compound. Some of us, myself included, were actually in the House chamber. And then even within the group that was in the House chamber, there were two groups. There were those who were on the floor, which is where members typically are. And those were the individuals who were speaking, the Arizonans, the Pennsylvanians, and some who were managing debate time. And then there were a group of us who wanted to, as members of Congress, be present during this debate time. But as we were trying to keep our distance, we were in the gallery area. And so initially the folks on the floor were evacuated out. And I think that's when it really became very clear to me. The pivot point was when Capitol police officers went up to the speaker who was presiding in the speaker's chair and whispered to her, presumably that she needed to leave. And I have seen the speaker, be pulled out of locations many times over, and typically she'll sort of give a nod and, leave. But the look on her face and the way in which she left, it was clearly not a phone call, not a ma'am, they need you someplace else, but this is a fast scenario. And so they pulled her out, and Congressman McGovern went into the speaker's chair. And then I saw them pull out Steny Hoyer, Leader McCarthy. And once they start evacuating all of the leadership, there's a problem. And it really just, for lack of a better phrase, it went downhill from there. But that was firsthand view on the floor, watching it all happen. For those who were at home, for those who were in their offices, it was as the reporting came out. And initially, some of the reporting was, pictures of people in ridiculous costumes, which I think has actually lent to that initial step where people didn't see the violence, because the videos of the violence, if you are standing next to police officers being beaten with American flag poles, no one's taking a video of that. So that took security footage, that took firsthand testimonials for it to come out just how terrible it actually was, not just how terrible it could have been.
Well, what's striking to me is the violence of the day is one thing, and it's abhorrent, and I think it just shocked the public conscience. But we've heard a lot now from members of Congress about the fear of threats of violence in the wake of January 6th. So, Liz Cheney came out publicly and said, members quite literally changed their votes, whether it was about certifying the election results or the impeachment of former President Donald Trump because they were afraid that people back home might literally come after them and their family members. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that.
So I have had those conversations directly with Republican counterparts. The day of the insurrection, it was a sort of a frenzied day. I was in the group that was trapped in the chamber. We were there for the entirety of the assault on the Capitol. We couldn't get out. And ultimately, it was once every insurrectionist was proned out on the ground with the police standing above them with, guns stabilizing the area that we were able to leave. And then hours later, we came back to the Capitol to cast our votes to certify the election. And I had a conversation. I was with another Democratic colleague. So my background's national security with CIA. I was with a Democratic colleague who has a veteran background. We were talking with a Republican counterpart who's also a veteran. The three of us were talking, and we were just full of worry about what had happened and talking about this and how, we have to certify the election, right? The states had certified these votes. We have to certify the election. The president's responsible for this. He didn't call it down. We're having this heated conversation. And our Republican counterpart said, but you guys don't understand. If I vote for this, like my base is they might hurt my family, right? And he's talking about his base voters. And he literally said those words to us as Democrats who, had flipped seats, have very broad electorates. I have a lot of people who agree with me, a lot of people who disagree with me. And I remember having this conversation with him saying, like, you're a military veteran. Like you were once in combat. You put yourself in dangerous situations because of the ideals and the Constitution that you were serving and you were upholding. And now, like, you're afraid of telling the truth because somebody who's being tied up in this conspiracy theory like might come after you. Like, I don't understand. And I remember this emotion of just being dumbfounded. And my Democratic colleague and I said, like, what do you think we have been dealing with? Like, we face threats, we face these challenges, and we have since we were elected, because the voters that you're trying to attract exist in our district as well. But we take on the responsibility of saying, no, sir, the election wasn't stolen. No, sir, like, I understand your concerns, but let me tell you what the certification process is. Let me tell you what our local election officials have done. Like, we do the work of telling the truth and telling it to people who may not want to hear it. Like, that's what we're asking of you. And so what Congresswoman Cheney has discussed is absolutely true. I'm sure she's had far more of those conversations than I have. But the ones that I have been, frankly, heartbreaking, because it's a cowardice that I just never imagined that certain people would demonstrate.
And I want to dig into that a little bit with you about where this phenomenon comes from, how we diagnose it, but also how we remedy it. I had the same experience and continue to have this with people who've sort of defected from the Trump universe or people who are considering it. And there's folks that were at the highest levels in that administration who've, served for many decades in the military or elsewhere, who aren't Trumpers per se, and know better and believe this man is a danger to the fabric of our republic. Yet many of them are still scared to publicly say it. And we've got sitting members of Congress who worry about the influence, it's not all about Donald Trump, who worry about the influence of really, really heated political discourse, but are unwilling to stand up against things like conspiracy theories and, efforts to subvert our elections. My first question is, do you still see that a year later? Is that still an influence over especially the Republican caucus? And how do you diagnose it and remedy it?
I had thought that after the insurrection, frankly, I thought that after the election in 2020, that for all of my colleagues who behind closed doors would speak negatively of the former president, would speak negatively of his influence, of the division, of the anger, of the lack of professionalism, of the stoking of fears and antagonistic behavior, all of those things, right? People speak very openly about that. I had thought that the 2020 election would be a pivot point, where they would be sort of broken. They'd be able to break free of his influence, go before their voters, their community, and say, our guy lost, the other guy won. What a disappointment. I'll find places to work with incoming President Biden, and where I disagree with him, I'll stand up vehemently for our conservative values, right? Like, that is what I anticipated so many people would say. But this kind of rolling conversation started where, as soon as the election happened and the election was called, there was the doubt, right? And the doubt was put there by former President Trump. No, they're stealing it. No, all of the things he said. And so then that conversation among my peers, right, when I was talking about, well, when are you acknowledging the president-elect Biden's win? Well, we've got to wait till, the elections are certified, right? So by the end of the month, by the end of November 2020, every state had certified their elections, and multiple states had recounts, and they did audits, and they certified their elections. Okay, well, how about now? Well, we'll wait till the Electoral College vote happens, because that's really the next step, right? And all during this time, there was space for people to say, our guy lost, let's move on, right? That narrative, that election to election, like that is the way that people turn a page. And then it was, let's wait till the Electoral College count. And then the Electoral College vote happened. Well, let's wait till the certification. And as people elongated that period, they created space for there to be doubt. Because if my congressman, who I trust and who I like and who I know, because he's represented me for a while, isn't out there congratulating Biden, then see, like, that is it. What I heard about on that, blogger, or that post, or that podcast, like, it must be true, because nobody's telling me any different, at least not somebody I trust. Like, that congressman I voted for 3 or 4 times. And so people lost their chance initially to reject the lies because they were silent. And then now we're in this place where that silence has occurred that for so long that you can't necessarily go back and say, well, actually, I just was kind of waiting it out. Of course, Biden won. All of these lies that I've allowed to percolate, they're not real. Because that's an even harder, if you didn't want to disappoint people in the beginning, you're certainly not going to step forward at this moment. And some people are, but not enough. And so it continues to be an issue because, frankly, the former president continues to have significant influence. And we see that certain members of Congress, the fringe right, ones not serious legislators, people who really have no interest in governing, whose names I just don't even feel inclined to mention, now they have such a presence in this land of conspiracies that if fellow members of their Republican caucus or conference cross them, then they promise to primary or support a primary, and they go after them. And that is a scary reality for some people. Again, I don't understand it, because I think that there is more to life than being a member of Congress. I enjoy my job and my responsibility significantly. But the idea of standing up for principle, if that's the end of your career, there certainly are worse things. And I wish that we would see more of people standing up for principle. But it's kind of you're in too deep. How do you get out of it now? And that silence has allowed so much of these conspiracies to really take root.
When I first started as a staffer just on Capitol Hill 20 years ago, one of the first things that was said to me by the parliamentarian was, Congress wasn't designed to pass laws. It was designed to stop bad laws being passed. And she made an interesting point about the founders and the structure of our system, which is that there's designed to be brakes, right? Safety release valves. But increasingly, it feels like those safety release valves are being exploited by some of these people to just stop legislation altogether. Gridlock for the sake of gridlock, so that they can go be celebrities rather than being legislators. I wonder, in your view, how do we really, what's the 10 and 20-year solution to this problem? I mean, outside of each congressional cycle, how do we break free of that gridlock that goes all the way to the street level? Because it's, Washington's not broken. We're
Yeah.
broken, right? It's across the country. We're so divided in our own households. How do we get after that in your view? And you've certainly got a straight line of sight into this right at the heart of it at the moment. But what's the 10 and 20-year time horizon look like?
So I don't think there's an easy answer to this. I think there's a couple elements. Certainly, gerrymandering is a significant contributor to this challenge. Because when people are in safe Democratic seats or safe Republican seats, you're dealing with just one group of your constituents. And then it is, how do I get the other Democrats or how do I get the other Republicans to vote for me? Which is frankly the challenge that we see in so many of my counterparts who are afraid of primaries, that they know that if they're not defending Trump, or if they're not, or even if they're not defending it, if they're rebuking these conspiracy theories or standing up for our free and fair elections, that they are inviting a primary challenge. And I think that polarization occurs more and more and more as we see more and more polarized congressional seats, be it because of gerrymandering, be it because of where people live and the political ideologies they share in those locations. But I think it's something that we need to be really attentive to. I think that even within our own parties, Republican and Democrat alike, that there's a loss of conversation that has occurred. This notion, right? I'm a Democrat, therefore, like what Democrats want is always right, what Republicans want always wrong, right? That is an oversimplification that I think far too many people at times can fall into. And so then you end up in this almost kind of ideological purity test of what is it that you want, as opposed to what legislation can you ultimately deliver. And I am certainly of the mindset that pragmatism and delivering, which means law passing the House, passing the Senate, getting signed by the president, that is a success far above and beyond, me making a speech or me introducing legislation that's really just meant to make a statement. Because I think our job is to govern and not make statements. And I think that we've entered a little bit of a space where, there's a popularity factor. And certainly some of the, individuals who are so aligned with the conspiracies and the former president have really embraced this, making statements like, my staff is a communications focused staff, not a legislative focused staff. Like, we're here to communicate, right? No, you were elected to Congress to govern. And so in principle, that happens from legislation you bring forward that you vote on and the work that you do with your local community to deliver for them. So I think part of it is we need to ensure we're reforming the expectations that voters have of what our job is. It isn't to kind of be the loudest and the brashest and all of these things that we see some of these individuals being, it's to govern. And I think maybe I'm Pollyanna and thinking that that's ultimately where we need to get back to, because I do think that in the age of social media and kind of constant access, that there's forever a change, even though some of the biggest offenders have been blocked from Twitter. I think that's the expectation of the electorate, I think, needs to get back to, we're not movie stars. We're supposed to be ideally boring, wonky people working on legislation. At least that's what I aspire to be.
Well, look, Congressman, I wouldn't say that you're boring. What I would say is you've developed a reputation that's very unique in Congress today, in that Democrats obviously really love you. You're a Democrat. We've gotten this far into the conversation. We haven't even needed to say that. But a lot of Republicans really admire you because you're an honest broker. You work across the aisle, whether it's from your district in Virginia to inside the Capitol. You're really, really well respected by both sides. How do we get more sort of hardworking, non-celebrity seeking members of Congress elected, right? How do we get the two parties to have the incentive to find those people? And is it things like, addressing gerrymandering and, voting laws and restrictions in various states? How do we get after that and get those people into politics?
I think it's about what motivates you to be here. For me, my motivation was to continue my service. I had left CIA back in 2014, assuming I would go off into kind of being a normal person in a suburban neighborhood with kids and a Girl Scout leader and a job in the private sector. And, my time of service was over. And then ultimately back in 2017, I decided to pivot back to public service through running for elected office. But I think foundationally for me, and I appreciate you saying the kind things, it comes down to the fact that if I think my policy ideas are better, I should be able to defend them to anyone. I should be able to explain them to anyone. And when I receive criticism, either from fellow Democrats or from Republicans, I should be able to weigh that and either, potentially adjust my legislation, or taking that criticism on board or those critiques on board, say, I hear what you're saying, but this is why I'm going to continue forward as I'm continuing forward. And I think that we live in a space a little bit where that level of collaboration or that level of criticism is not always commonplace or welcome. But I think we have a responsibility that, if I really think that the principles and the policies I'm working towards are good, then why wouldn't I want to talk to anyone about them? And I'll give an example. We have a prominent Tea Party organization across the district that I represent. I was the first Democrat elected since 1968 in my district. And around the time of the first impeachment, I was invited to speak with the Tea Party. And I think a little bit to their surprise, I attended. And, they're a very vocal, organized Tea Party in one of our counties. And I said, here I am impeaching a president that all of these individuals adore and vote for. Like, I owe it to them to explain why. Likely they won't agree with me, and that's okay. But I have a responsibility to be just as accountable to them as I have to be to those who, were right there along with me and, perhaps, very pleased with the notion that we were impeaching the former president. And I think that, while some people thought that that's why on earth would you do that? I think when you focus it back and pull it back on service, because they deserve to hear from me why I was taking an action that they found to be extraordinarily problematic. And I hope that to some degree, while, I don't think that I got many people on board with the notion of why the former president deserved and earned that impeachment, I think at least being open and clear and willing to present myself to them, at least demonstrated a respect for them in a way that I think was important, at least at that time. Certainly so much has changed since then. But that doesn't fully answer the how do we change it over the next 20 years. But I think it's a little bit about the expectations. I think, frankly, on Capitol Hill, there's too many places where we're in our corners. And, I've had the experience, and I'll mention a name, Chip Roy, a Republican from Texas. We do not agree on much of anything, but we have the same birthday, and we both went to UVA, right? So I'll take my commonalities where they come. And so we've actually had a funny conversation where we've sat on the House floor and said, okay, literally we agree on nothing, but we have the same birthday. We both went to UVA. Like, what else do we agree on? And we've gone through different things. And the small sliver of overlap in the Venn diagram of where Abigail Spanberger and Chip Roy fall on policy relates to debt-related issues, right? And different pivots there. We both think that the debt is a national security threat. Some of the aspects of how we want to deal with it, very divergent. And we both think that members of Congress should be held to a high ethical standard. And so we've actually introduced a debt clock piece of legislation that says in the appropriations room, there should be a debt clock. It's a little cheesy, a little silly, but right, we found agreement, so why not?
Hey, as a recovering appropriator, I totally agree.
You should know how
It
much
should be
that
on
is
the
as you're
wall.
appropriating more money. And that one's a little bit kind of, you know, it's not meant to be funny, but people react with a little bit of a chuckle. And then another piece of legislation is if you're a member of Congress, you shouldn't hold individual stocks. If you are elected with individual stocks, you, your spouse, your dependent child need to roll them into a blind trust. You can have 401ks, you can have ETFs, but individual stocks where you might have insider knowledge about what you should buy or what you should sell, it's not appropriate. And it's not appropriate because we want the American people to trust us and we want to give them no reason for doubt about our kind of ethical compass. And so those are two areas where when I sat down with this colleague, again, not a lot in common, we said, okay, like let's try to find where our common ground is. And I think for me, I think that's a little bit of like a parlor game, but I think if more people approached it in that sense that, you know, as you start to layer those Venn diagrams, you get different levels of overlap. And honestly, at the heart of what is the threat to our democracy is the lack of trust that exists. And there's many, many researchers who have, you know, written extraordinary books, but it's divisions, it's lack of trust, it's othering. And the more we can lead by example and say, yeah, I disagree with that guy on almost every aspect of policy, but like this is where we find a little bit of that common ground. Like that's how you build up those little hills of trust that I think have been so eroded over the past however many years.
I'm so glad that you said that because I wanted to bring up something that, you know, over at the team at Renew America, we've talked about a lot, which is moments where the country came together to meet the moment. And I want to paint a picture really quick. And that is, you know, we had a cold day in January, 1,500 Americans, you know, surrounding a federal building, armed, led in part by former members of the military, disgruntled, feeling like the system had left them behind and wanting to upend that system rather than work through it. Now, when I paint that picture, people think of January 6th, 2021. I'm actually talking about January 25th, 1787, which was the day of Shays' Rebellion, which was a group of Americans who attempted to commit insurrection against the United States. They tried to storm an armory in Massachusetts, and for, you know, students of history, that the federal government couldn't put down the insurrection. A hastily assembled state militia had to put it down. But I bring up that episode because it has echoes with our history. And after Shays' Rebellion, rather than try to bury it and forget about it or deny it, political leaders said, agree or disagree with their underlying grievances, which were about taxes. We got to do something about this. The Articles of Confederation aren't working. The way that we've constructed our country has clearly caused a lot of anger at the core level. We've got to fix this. And by the end of the year, that same year, they had come together, drafted a new U.S. Constitution, passed a new U.S. Constitution, and they united to meet the moment. So people disagreed about it at the elite level in Congress, about how to handle that situation and in American politics. But they knew that there had to be some unity in response. You know, pulling us back to January 6th, we're a year out from that. No, we don't need to go have a new constitutional convention and rewrite the Constitution. But what sort of big things should we have done in this past year in response to this five-alarm fire that is a second insurrection in American history?
Yeah, I think that example that you give is such an extraordinarily important one because, and as you phrased it, you know, whether they agreed with the insurrectionists or not, you still have to understand what motivated them. I think that continues to be true for January 6th. Certainly, those who violently attacked police officers and injured more than 150 police officers and damaged a building and brought havoc that day and intended to do real violence, right? In no way is any of that defensible, right? Those are criminal acts, and those who gave them support supported those criminal acts. But if we don't take the time to say what led them there, what conspiracy theories, what ideas, what belief system, however wrong it may be, what would provoke someone, particularly among the veterans and the former law enforcement officers, what would provoke someone, be it, of someone who's previously raised their hand to support and defend the Constitution, or, a small business owner from Texas, or a realtor from Georgia, or, insert kind of this example of people from all different aspects and communities across the country, what would bring them to the Capitol that day? I think, and what I'm looking forward to, and I say that with sort of no enthusiasm, but what I'm looking forward to is the continued work of the January 6th committee, because much of that ideally will come out in some of the conversations and some of the public testimony. But what I think will be important is that we, as the American public, regardless of what your title or what your role is, if it's citizen or if it's elected official, have to have our ears open to what were the triggers that brought people forward. And frankly, there's been some extraordinary interviews with people who have been radicalized, who were there on January 6th, and who have since kind of stepped away from it. And they bring a really important perspective to the conversation. It's one that I hope that we'll pay great attention to. But in order to get past this day, there's going to have to be a willingness to view it for what it was, the threat that indeed was there. There has to be a bit of grace demonstrated in wanting to understand how we got to that point, because there are people's opinions and ideas and fears that we need to understand, however wrong they may be or ill-founded they may be, in order to ensure that this sort of occurrence, this violence, never happens again. And I think that we're expecting to see, with the former president giving his own press conference and speech, is not going to be productive towards that end. Unfortunately, I don't know how many elected Republican members of Congress are going to be joining in some of the commemoration events, or events of remembrance or reflection that will be occurring at the Capitol. And I think that's really unfortunate. Certainly in the early days, so many of them were forceful in rebuking that violence. And since then, so many have withdrawn, if not full on reversed their positions.
Do you think we're at a higher risk or a lower risk today of something like that happening again?
I think, as a former intel officer, I'm not very willy-nilly with those assessments.
Moderate, or low confidence in your assessment?
So in my recognizing that it's, a lot of, I have no direct sourcing, no firsthand knowledge. I think I would a little bit pivot the question and say, there is no reason at this point to believe that we have reduced the threat that existed in advance of January 6th. And so the threat that existed in advance of that occurrence continues to be present. And indeed, to some degree, the fact that we've seen so many people excuse away or explain away, or even worse, blame the FBI for January 6th, or, blame Democratic sort of role players for January 6th, presents us with, I think, what continues to be a very risky, fertile ground for those conspiracies and those same grievances to take hold again in the future.
You mentioned earlier, not by name, some more extreme members of Congress. I'm not going to put you on the spot about their names. We'll call one of them she who should not be named, has indicated that there's a possibility, if the Republicans retake the majority in the House, that they could make Donald Trump the Speaker of the House. Now, a lot of our viewers don't realize technically that's possible. The Speaker of the House of Representatives doesn't have to be an elected member of Congress. What do you make of those types of declarations? One, should folks be worried that there are Republicans who really would try to make that happen? And I say that as a lifelong Republican, and that concerns me deeply. So one, should folks actually be worried about that? But two, what does that say about where we're at in our politics? Can we get past this cult of personality and just get back to arguing about boring policy issues like you mentioned?
I would defer to some of the Republicans in the Renew America movement, because some of the lifelong Republicans who've been able to to really step forward, stand up for our Constitution, our democratic republic, and frankly, values, be they more liberal, be they more conservative, American values, in a way that we are not seeing certain members of Congress do the same. They may know better, but I will say there is a real significant real chance. The way that it works is on the day that we're all sworn in, every person casts their vote in spoken form. There's a roll call vote, and you name the person you want to have as speaker, and it can be any living person. There's a lot of caveats. Any living person, they have to be a real person. You can't say Minnie Mouse, et cetera, et cetera. But absolutely, people could cast their vote for Donald Trump. Now, would there be the necessary, depending upon how many people are present that day, in theory, 218 to get him to actually be Speaker of the House? Likely not. So the idea that he would actually be Speaker of the House is not a likely scenario. But the idea that we might actually see failed speaker votes, 1 or 2 or 3, because there's going to be a group of people that, at least on the first round of voting, would want to cast their vote for him just to demonstrate some loyalty, to communicate some sort of message. Like, that in and of itself is disruptive and frankly ridiculous, because being the Speaker of the House is a unique role. It's a little bit, I mean, it's an administrative role, it's a leadership role, it's all these things. I mean, even just on its face, a former president who spent no time in the legislative branch has zero skill set to be Speaker of the House, which, in fairness, I think is probably one of the worst jobs in America. It's herding cats all day long. But even the fact that as a show of loyalty, people would say, yes, I'm going to utter that name. I'm going to say his name. It actually is so nonsensical that the only way that it can be perceived is this is just a place for them to demonstrate, their fidelity, their loyalty, their commitment to this one individual, not a commitment to ideology, not a commitment to policy goals or objectives or even their constituents, but one man and one man alone. And so I think that's the deeper problem of it, is the fact that what she's actually trying to communicate in presumably making that vote a year from now.
Yeah. Well, it's chilling even to hear that, the process would get held up by folks trying to do that kind of a vote. I want to ask you about Rays of Light, and we've got a couple of minutes left here. What are the big things that give you hope right now in our politics? And then, because you are a human being, and I know folks sometimes put congressmen and women in the category of, robots or that sort of thing, we want to know things you like right now, TV shows you like, books that you really like, music that you like at the moment. We're going to end on that note and find out about the human Abigail Spanberger and things that maybe we should be listening to and watching right now. But first, what gives you hope in our politics?
What gives me hope is the fact that there are people who continue to engage, who continue to believe that we can and do and should be better and do better in our political system. There are people that, despite the fact that they've been volunteering or engaged for years, still choose to spend their free time focused on policy they care about or advocacy that they care about. That is what gives me hope, because when we get, at some point, at which I hope never comes, when people in our community who care about the environment or care about gun violence prevention, who care about the homeless or food insecurity, when they stop doing that advocacy work, and be it policy specific or party specific, then we've really reached a horrible turning point. But for right now, I continue to have hope, because there are so many people who believe in the value of what a functioning government, our democracy, our country can deliver, can be, should be, the promise of our nation. And as long as those people kind of spread out across the country continue to believe in our nation, then we can continue to be steady and to advocate for those, like, that beautiful promise that is our country. And so that is what still gives me hope. The fact that there are so many young people, certainly I've met across our district, who advocate for things that they care about with an enthusiasm that, despite a global pandemic that in some cases now has been going on for, an eighth of their life or a ninth of their life or a tenth of their life, are they still focused on what they want to do, what they want to see. And that energy and that hope, it requires that those of us who kind of can actualize and bring momentum to the things they care about, that requires us to keep on going. And so that's why I continue to have a lot of hope, because there's a lot of people who need a lot of things, and they need us to do our job and to stand up for our nation. And, frankly, having been a former CIA officer, overseas, we're the United States of America, right? I want to make sure that any person who walks into an embassy or walks into a diplomatic engagement or walks into, an aid organization, that when they are coming and presenting themselves as representatives of the United States government, that still comes with the awe and the excitement and the pride that we've always brought to, our goals of just being a good example of strength, of kindness, of goodness, of possibility, and being that place that people dream about, and, being the type of country that other people, across the world, think about and aspire to be a part of this American project. And so, that's what keeps me hopeful, because, that's who we are. That's who we should be. And I guess the fact that there's fault lines and that it's been shaky, just if that makes us all recommit and focus and dig down to make it firmer, stronger into the future, then we'll come out having been better for it. And I refuse to see any other option.
Congresswoman, exceptionally well said. I think that's inspiring to everyone who's watching this. But now I'll take us from the high-minded to the mindless, because we all have to check out of politics at some point. It's a pride-swallowing siege, as I always say, every day, to be in this difficult fight at the moment. So what do you distract yourself with? Give us it could be a book or a movie or a podcast. And this is not an official Congresswoman Spanberger endorsement. I will make that clear. Not an official endorsement. I will tell you right now, I'm watching the show Tehran, which is about a Mossad officer who infiltrates Iran, and it's on Apple Plus. It's gripping, very good show. What are you watching, or do you even have time?
So I don't currently have a show, but I thank you for the recommendation, because I think Tehran's going to be next. Frankly, all of my podcasts are really all political. I can't step away. I try to follow something else. I even followed some home and garden podcast, and I'll pull it up every once in a while. I'll listen for 3 minutes, and then I'll go back to, any of the other things. I find the focus group podcast, I find absolutely fascinating, and a variety of other political ones kind of across the spectrum. Like everybody else, I'm probably not making any recommendations anyone can follow here. Ted Lasso is a big source of joy. I am convinced that one of my constituents, who's a small town community mayor, might be the source character for it. So that gives me a particular fondness. But I actually, a secret, since, we're being honest here, a secret love that I have is for Christmas themed romantic comedies, the very cheesy kinds.
This is news. This is going to be headline making for us. Interesting, like Hallmark Channel type stuff.
Yeah, Netflix. Yes. Mm-hmm. And Netflix has their whole version of them, and and it's funny because my daughter, who's 13, was recounting to me that she had been at school and they were talking about something before class started, and they were all kind of complaining about things at home or whatnot. And she's like, ugh, my mother makes us watch all these rom-coms. They're Christmas, family movie night. And she starts kind of mocking me. And one of the other girls in her class says, wait, our Congresswoman like Christmas rom-coms.
Good.
And my daughter's recounting this to me. I'm like, oh my goodness. But I don't think that makes her a very good attack ad. So I think I'm safe there. But yes, the really like the silliest of the silly with the, I don't know,
I'm so glad you said that.
Ranch in Wyoming and they get snowed in and surprised.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Or like you're secretly a princess from some country that doesn't exist. Yeah.
We just watched one of those not too long ago, and my partner and I, she and I had a discussion about the value of these shows, and she's a big fan, and I said they would make really good SNL skits. They just seem prime for SNL to go mock them, but look, they're a good distraction.
They're like family-friendly soap operas or something.
That's right. Well, that's fantastic. Well, look, Congresswoman, let me say this, and I hinted at it earlier. It's incredible. Democrats love you. Republicans admire you. There's very few people like you right now in politics. A highly unifying member of Congress, a very post-partisan thinking member of Congress. We're grateful for your service and what you've been doing in Washington, D.C. So thank you. We look forward to following up. And we're not going to forget that you may know the real Ted Lasso in Virginia. So if that small town mayor wants to make a public appearance, we just may be willing to have a platform to host them. So, Congresswoman, we're really grateful for your time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. And thanks so much. Happy New Year to everybody.
Thank you. And back over to Mariana.
Thank you, Miles. And thank you, Congresswoman. I think we're going to have to compare some notes on those Hallmark movies, though, because I, too, am a sucker for a really good rom-com. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experiences and the things that you've been doing. To everyone that joined us, thank you. We're so excited to have you here with us in the new year. And if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to join us on January 20th. We will have Arizona's Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, Bill Gates. He'll be joining Ram Chat. In the meantime,
the other Bill Gates. Bill Gates.
Yes, not that Bill Gates from Microsoft, but the Bill Gates from Arizona. We're so excited. And in the meantime, to stay up to date with everything Renew America Movement is doing and how you can tune in for our next Ram Chat or even catch the previous episode, be sure to follow us on Twitter at Renew America, subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Renew America Movement, and sign up on our website for all the latest information, renewamericamovement.com. Have a fantastic rest of your